The format we're going to follow today, each of the gentlemen is going to speak for 15-20 minutes just on what athlete-centered coaching means to them as a coaching philosophy, and give a little bit about it, some personal experiences and whatnot. And then we really want to open it up to be discussion-based. I think this is a really great topic to generate a lot of discussion. These guys are going to bounce off of each other. You guys can ask a lot of questions, and we'll just we'll see where the discussion takes us. So I'm going to circulate the sign-in sheet. You guys are all pretty used to this by now, just to get your information for promoting future presentations and just to see who was here. So that's going to pass around. And I just really want to quickly do a brief plug for the Atlantic Coaches Conference that we've got coming up in April. It's April 26th and 27th down in Halifax. It's going to be 2 days of coaching professional development for high school club coach up to provincial and national team coach. It's going to be a really great conference. So we've got some handouts here at the end if you guys want to grab one and see who's presenting and what it's all about and information on registration. So without further ado, I think we're going to start with Alan.
All right. Yeah, sure. I'll stand up. I have to be over here so I can click. That should work actually. All right. As Megan said, I'm Alan Oldham. I'm the provincial high performance coach for rowing, and it's really my first sort of seminar opportunity to talk as a coach to a group of coaches. So I'm kind of glad I'm going first, so now I can make all my mistakes and not worry about making them while these guys are going. Coach or athlete-centered coaching is really something which I've tried to embrace for my whole coaching career, and as an athlete I feel that I was fortunate in having coaches that also embraced this philosophy. I think that that's more of an accident than by purpose, because rowing really lends itself to athlete-centered coaching in that we're in a sport where once you're in a boat on the water, the coach can't do anything. You're out on your own, and you have to go and be able to perform and deliver yourself across the line as best as possible. So in that regard, it really is a sport which does allow for athlete-centered coaching. But there's lots of pitfalls which you can fall into, and I've fallen into many. Having done a lot of research on athlete-centered coaching in the last 2 weeks after finding out I was doing this, I sort of saw a lot of solutions to pitfalls that I've fallen into trying to deliver this philosophy. And it will be interesting seeing what these two bring to the table, and I'll definitely be learning a lot today. So I think, as I said, it's really intuitive as a coach to want to do what's best for the athlete and to bring the athlete's dreams to the fore and the athlete's ambitions. But as I said, it's a little difficult to do in practice. I'm going to basically take you on a little sort of roundabout journey through my philosophy as a coach and what I've learned. And we'll start with not a textbook on coach-centered or athlete-centered coaching, but on a book that is on every rower's shelf, The Wind in the Willows, which I don't know how many people have read this book. No one. Oh, it's a classic. It's a classic Victorian children's literature written by Kenneth Grahame. One of the most brilliant quotes, often quoted, and actually there's a part of this, Messing About in Boats, quoted in the Long-Term Athlete Development Plan by Rowing Canada, and our current high-performance director just loves this book. Is it so nice as all that? Asked the mole shyly. The mole is the one sitting down in the chair. Nice? It's the only thing, said the water rat solemnly as he leaned forward for his stroke. Believe me, my young friend, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats. So this, I think, is a great summary of what rowing means to me and what I think rowing could mean for everyone that participates. It's really just fun getting out and messing about in a boat. And as a coach, it's easy to forget that, forget why people come into the sport. And I always try and remember, and it's really important to remember, what draws people to your sport, what creates meaningful connections for the athletes, and what are the elements that make your sport really fun. So, I was asking myself, why do I coach? And the few textbooks that I have read on coach or athlete-centered coaching, I start with this point. So I wrote down a few things why I coach. I love the sport. I want to give back. It's pretty cliche answers, right? Inspired by those who coach me. And that's really important for me. Giving opportunities I had and didn't have, which I think is something a lot of coaches coach in order to deliver. The exhilaration of developing successful athletes, winning. Pride in my athletes' post-sport accomplishments. There's nothing better than being asked to write a reference letter for a Rhodes Scholarship or then hearing that they got the scholarship. Things like that are really things that I do take pride in. Winning Olympic gold, something which I really want to do. I really wanted to do it as an athlete, and now I really want to do it as a coach. And not all my athletes are going to get there. It's important that I know that. So one of my favorite American poets, Robert Frost, said, "I am not a teacher, but an awakener." And I really love this quote, because we're trying to awaken our athletes what's inside of them, and they might not realize what's inside of them. And if we constantly put our ambitions and our dreams in front of them, they're going to chase after them and maybe succeed, but they're really not going to be meeting their potential. So we want to understand and facilitate our athletes' ambitions and realize that they're different than ours. One thing that I did completely coincidentally, in line with this, it lines up with this seminar perfectly, is I recently asked my athletes to send me 140 characters, so the length of a tweet, on why they row. Why do I row? And I've always found it really difficult to keep myself concise, so I thought that it would be a good challenge. And I received anything from an essay on, with 5 paragraphs explaining how they got into the sport and what they love about it. And my response was, that was brilliant, but give me it in 140 words, or 140 characters, to just something a little shorter than 140. So some of them I'm going to put up here. So I row because I have a passion for competition. I row because setting a goal, training and achieving that goal is a fantastic feeling. I row because I'm competitive and love racing and winning. I'm better at it than I'm at anything else. An interesting reason. The feeling after a workout keeps me coming back. I live for it. So here's another quote, which Carl Jung, famous psychologist. "One looks back with appreciation to the brilliant teachers, but with gratitude to those who touched our human feelings. The curriculum is so much necessary raw material, but warmth is the vital element for the growing plant and for the soul of the child." And I really think that this is true, and being a coach is effectively being a teacher. Like so many coaches, my own background is in teaching. I have a teaching degree, and I feel that there's so much from teaching that transposes right into coaching and vice versa. There's very similar core values, which we try espouse in our athletes and our students: self-respect, dignity, and probably above all, trust. Trust in their own abilities, trust in the abilities of each other, and trust in you as the coach. Some other things which come right out of, these are quoted right from, I'm trained in Ontario, so the Ontario curriculum guidelines. We want to know and understand what the curriculum expectations are as teachers, educators, and coaches. What do we want? And then we want to go about getting that curriculum expectation met using all the facilities at our disposal, all the resources available, and ensure that there is maximum participation at all times. It's not fun for someone to sit on the bench, and someone who is maybe a bench athlete in high school has the potential to be a brilliant world-class player in their later career. But if they sit on the bench, they're going to leave the sport. So it's our job as coaches to make sure that we maximize participation, use a variety of assessment methods so that we don't stress out our athletes too much, and we allow them to grow. So there's formative assessment, which is low pressure, sort of this is how you did. No selection criteria attached to that sort of assessment. The summative would be like a selection for a team. Peer assessments are important. I think for developing athletes, it's really important for them to assess one another, know where they stand, and understand that it's all right. Self-assessment. And this is probably the most difficult for athletes. I love this picture because this is one of our top provincial athletes. She's just looking over the competition, and she ended up winning a bronze medal there. I'm just wondering what she's, actually I know what she's thinking there. She's thinking, all I have to do is row down to the end and I won. And the girl behind her was not competition for her. So I challenged her to assess her ability after that race, and she said she could have done much better. This is not photoshopped. Sometimes equipment breaks.
I saw that happen.
Yeah, this is a buddy of mine. This is an old-timers boat. It's at the head of the Trent University's homecoming, and these guys have been drinking all day. He broke his oar, so he jumped out of the boat, taking one for the team, right? This would be sort of a teachable moment if this happened in a practice. And you want to look for this sort of, not necessarily this is a little ridiculous, but a moment which is maybe not what you were expecting. And turn that around into something which people can take a lesson from. Because there's lessons in everything. It might be useful for Ian to, if I were coaching right there, to work on his breaststroke or some other swimming instruction. In line with teachable moments, TGFU, does anyone know what TGFU is? Okay, you know. TGFU is Teaching Games for Understanding. This is another critical element of the phys ed curriculum documents, I believe in New Brunswick as well. And basically what TGFU is, you want to break down the elements of a complex skill, like a volleyball game, break it down into various elements, say a bump, and make a game out of it, so that points are arrived at, or teams win or lose depending on their skill in that particular area. So in rowing, it could be done, you could set different boats just rowing with their hands only, or rowing with their oars squared and not feathered as we turn our oars back and forth, working on various elements. And the challenge is then for the athlete to execute well, and there's a direct and immediate result, which is either they win the fun competition, or they're awarded points, or so on. And this way, they can enhance their ability in various skills, and you put them all together, and they've had fun while learning the overall. All right, so now we move to one issue I know that exists in rowing. I'm not quite sure if this exists in other sports. I would imagine so. That there's a myth that exists that community clubs cannot exist cannot exist side by side with high performance, and that athletes of both types cannot be in the same institute or same organization or institution. This has seen a lot of clubs that I've worked with sort of scratch their head when I'm trying to say that both can work together. The argument on the side of community club is that high performance athletes are taking all the best equipment, doing this and that, and getting all the best coaching, and what are they giving back to the community? And high performance, I've seen a lot of high performance clubs that actually complain about not having a good sense of community, which is also interesting. What I would say is that community is actually essential to success. It's really important that athletes, coach, and members of a club community or a sports team feel united in their approach to tackling the learning of the skill of the sport and representation of their club or team. Oh, that's Zoom, sorry. There we go. All right, community gives support and roots sustainability. Without a sustainable community base, a club is maybe going to have one or two brilliant athletes, and then what happens at the end. They go off, and maybe they go to the Olympics, go to the national team, and who are you left with? You're left with really nothing. I haven't been reading this, so I have no idea where I am. All right. Winners are going to emerge in this sort of a system, in a system where community is stressed, and winning is not necessarily the objective of what you should be striving for. It's a result. Right? Placing medals and victory on the water above everything else is really unsustainable. and does little to encourage participation in the sport for the love of it. And really, as I sort of identified earlier, and for me, love of the sport is what encourages athletes to stay with the sport. All right, I have the best job in the world because I get to sit on the water every morning and watch the sunrise and watch it go down every evening. That's the moon and Venus right there this last fall. All right, so another quote from one of the athletes. When I row it, I feel invincible, stronger and more alive than I love. Grammar's horrible here. I love being out on the water in the morning, starting out in the pitch black and watching the sun rise and cast upon the water. I row because it makes me happy, it makes me strong, and I love it. Rowing, obsession to get faster, race, compete, team, challenge a competition and win. I'm excited for my long career in rowing. This was a 15-year-old that wrote this. I row because I love the thrill of racing. I love rowing early in the morning and seeing the sun rise from the middle of the river. I train to stay in shape, to compete at a high level, and for the great team atmosphere. I've become very fond of rowing. The satisfactory feeling after each workout keeps me going. The people I have around me are great, and mainly I enjoy and love the sport. These are quotes all from our Canada Games training group. Not all of them are talking about winning, but it doesn't make me feel like they don't want to win. So this is a quote which means quite a bit to me, and I know that the Olympics has done some interesting things lately, but the Olympics to me is about this. The most important thing in the Olympic Games is not to win, but to take part. Just as the most important thing in life is not the triumph, but the struggle. The essential thing is not to have conquered, but to have fought well. And Pierre de Coubertin, who founded the modern Olympic movement, said these 100 years ago, but I think that they're exactly what we need to embrace today. And he was talking about, something which is fundamental to athlete-centered coaching. The fact that we need to de-stress winning and stress success and personal achievement. So achieving personal best becomes the measure of what is success. A true champion first has to accept their limitations and identify the areas for growth. A victory over others is merely an outcome of such personal development. And excuse me. Self-efficacy and true confidence in ability will be the result of knowing one's limits at any given time and understanding what it will take to overcome them. So this crew, I coached this crew last spring. It's a high school crew from my hometown in Hamilton, Ontario. And they were so proud of this result, and I was too. Anyone want to guess what place they came? Oh, yeah, they came second. So they came second. Could they have won? Probably not. But they could have come third, they could have come fourth, they could have come fifth, they could have come sixth. And they came second and just dominated. The performance was dominant. They had a brilliant race. It was the great end of the season. And here's them again, another crew, two girls from that other boat, again, won another silver medal. And I was equally as proud of them for this medal as I was for the first. We need to take pride in those little successes. Coming second does not mean the first loser. Coming second means you're the next winner. And it means that you're going to go on and eventually be that winner. Maybe not for that age group or that weight category, but if you stick with it, you'll eventually, your personal best will be better than other people's personal bests. To be beaten is not to be defeated. So this is one of the most, I got this about an hour and a half ago. Attention, go, click, boom, the sounds we row for, teamwork, what we train for, pain, grit, sweat, what we push for, our best, what we strive for, success, ecstasy, triumph, accomplishment. That's what I row for. Another one of our Canada Games athletes. And I row because I want an Olympic gold medal. The only way to achieve this is through training, hard work, commitment, and determination. So these athletes know what they want. Some of them want to aim for the top, some of them just love to row. And all of them can be successful. We just need to realize that winning takes time, effort, commitment to self-improvement. and that it really does take a lot of effort to achieve great things. So, to conclude, we'll return once again to the riverbank where Ratty and Molly are sitting in their boat. Nothing seems really to matter, that's the charm of it, says the water rat. Whether you get away or you don't, whether you arrive at your destination or whether you reach somewhere else, or whether you never get anywhere at all. So I think that this is a marvelous way of summing up the rat's relationship to rowing, but also demonstrating its clear understanding of what it really means to be a coach. We need to inspire athletes to love why they train and learn how to take themselves in any direction they can dream of. That's it. And this is the thing that sticks out of the picture for me. I'm always sitting around the coach boat looking at good scenery. All right, any questions? Do I take questions now, or do I wait?
Whatever you like.
Questions? No? All right, good.
Pardon?
I can click through.
Okay. So you're going to stay up here?
Yeah.
She knows my age. And she knows how much we know about these things. I really liked your descriptions of the athletes and what they said. The fact that you got them to talk about them, I think is really, really an important piece of athlete-centered coaching, is to talk about them. And so that's awesome. I really like that. I'm going to take a little bit different kind of track. I'm going to start with a story that I have never forgotten. And it's not a big deal. And the only person who remembers it is me. But it was important to me. And so I was coaching in Massachusetts. I was coaching in New England for some time. And I was at a university there. And we had, at this particular point in time, I was doing a USOC coaching clinic for javelin women. In other words, what the US used to do in those days was the Americans would have a whole bunch of clinics around the States. Out of that would come a group of athletes that they would select for trials, and then after trials, of course, the rest was the Olympics or Worlds or whatever else they wanted to do. So this happened to be women's javelin, northeastern United States Olympic regionals. And we had about 14 girls from northeastern United States. 14 women, girls. They're my age. Anybody under 40 is a girl. But anyway, as I said, I was back in Canada then, but they invited me down to coach at this comp. And they were about, to say, 14, 15, and they had 3 coaches. And basically they divided the groups up into about 4 or 5 athletes apiece. And then you'd come together every morning, you'd come together every night, do an assessment, see films, and everything else. And I couldn't help it. Notice there was a girl who came, and I knew she was from Connecticut, that's all I knew. But she came and she kept looking, she wasn't in my group. I had a group over here, and she kept, I knew she wanted to talk. By the end of the sessions, I knew that sometime before this camp was over, she wanted to talk to me. And she gave me plenty of reasons why, like just with the body language, with eye contact, with everything. And so eventually I gave her a chance. And we kind of met, and I broke the ice, and I went over, and she said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I said, "Well, not really, but you look familiar," which is a nice thing to say, always. But she did look familiar. And she said, "Well, your team competed against us." And, "Okay." And she said, "Yeah, and you coach, Paula over there." "Yes." And so the ice was broken. And so she started talking to me, and she said, I really felt I needed to talk to you. Now, we'd never met. At least I didn't think we'd ever met, unless it happened when we competed against each other. Or at least our team did. I didn't. And she said, I just felt I needed to talk to somebody about this. I said, okay. She said, and she started talking to me about, she said, no, all I've cared about as an athlete has been javelin for the last 8 or 9 years. That's it. She said, when I found it in grade 9, in high school, she said, I knew this is what I wanted to do. And that just took over my life. She says, I went to school, all I thought about, I trained every day, I did all the things I could do. I got through high school, I was a good thrower, I spent 4 years in high school, and she said, I knew javelin was my thing. I got a scholarship at one of the Connecticut universities. I got a scholarship for 4 years. That's all I did, she said, and I went to school, and I trained, and I trained, and I competed. And she said, that's all I really wanted to do. And I'm listening. Good for you. You know, and I'm wondering, where is this going? And she said, I just wanted you to know that for 8 years, that's all I wanted to do in sport, was throw javelin. And she said, and now I'm at this camp. And then she looked at me, and then this is when it started to happen. She said, and I know this is the end. I looked at her and I said, okay. And she said, yeah. She says, I know why you're here. She says, you're here because you're a development coach, and you're here to coach that girl. And she was a high school girl, grade 12, from Boston, who was on scholarship, full ride in California, and she was a thrower. I mean, she was a thrower. And she says, you're down here to help her transition from high school to university, and I know that. And I know that she is leaving, she's going to move on from this camp. And I said, well, you're not wrong. There's some truth to that. And she said, and I know that this is it. I'm not going to go on. And she says, and I know it. But she said, I had to talk to somebody about it. That's a heavy burden. And then she looked at me and she said, and then she started to well up. 22-year-old girl, 23-year-old girl, totally committed. Now she's starting to well up, and she looks and she says, please, can you tell me whether it was worth it? Oh, God. You coast through life, you know, and you're doing your coaching and you're doing all this stuff, and you get some kid who's been committed for 8 years, knows that it's the end, and you know what? It was. Most people leave sport because they're cut if they get to that level, or they can't make the next level. And she said, I don't know if it was worth it. Can you tell me? And she was serious. And I gave her some kind of an answer, but I don't think it was a very good answer because I was stunned. To imagine somebody after all this time asking me if I thought it was worth it that she did something she really wanted to do. And I've never forgotten that. I've never seen her since. She's still in my mind, and that was 35 years ago. And it still haunts me. It still haunts me that first of all, I felt really bad that I couldn't give her an answer. And then finally, it's finally come to me after 35 years that I couldn't give her the answer. The only person to give her the answer is her. And then I felt worse, because how can somebody live through 8 years of a lifetime of being an athlete, on scholarship, throwing, being celebrated, and asking somebody if it was worth it? Think about that, if you're an athlete. And I wonder how many athletes really feel like that. Is it worth it? Well, we've got to make sure, and you have to make sure, that somebody doesn't have to come to you and ask you if it's worth it. And it really bothered me, and they say it still does, and it haunts me. So, athlete-centered coaching, partly when I coach now, athlete-centered coaching, my job is to make sure that every kid, when they're finished, they don't have to say that. At least they've got some reason why it was worth it. And so, in terms of, this is after a few years of coaching, and I wanted to start with what I believe. Because some of you have probably been long enough. Do you remember the COA belief statements? Okay, I was involved in that committee that did the belief statements. That's an interesting story because we did the belief statements and then we validated it across the country. And Canada was the first one who actually, Caroline Leather, who was actually the president and then later the executive director of the Canadian Olympic Association at that time, she was the one who fostered this, and she really believed in the Olympic reality, in Olympism, that whole value system that surrounds the Olympics called Olympism. And we ended up doing belief statements, and I found it really interesting that after a while you have to post your belief statements. What do you believe? I mean, that's why, part of the reason I think what we were asked to come here is what do we believe as coaches? And these are primary things that I've come to absolutely believe in. And I must put a little precursor at the beginning too, in the fact that I'm a coach. I take my job seriously. I love to coach. And it matters. And I don't want to be a floater. And I have never, ever, ever coached so that I enhance my athletes' chances of losing. I've never done that. So obviously, we're engaged in competition and we know it's a fine line. So some things that I live up to, or I try to live up to, and I think about, is number one, effectiveness. I believe that it's not the word affect. We influence, but effect in research is a cause and effect. Something causes something to happen. And there is a cause. Sometimes it's significant, sometimes it's not, but it's there. I believe when a person learns something, they are changed. Okay, they might not even know it, but unconsciously or consciously, sometimes we can see the effectiveness by an improvement in throwing, or an improvement in skating, or an improvement. But sometimes we don't see the effectiveness of something that's maybe more unconscious. But I believe that when kids engage in something, they change. And of course, because we're engaged in it, so do we. So number one, I believe in effect. So therefore, like I look at this room. I'm a bit of a Harvardian. I don't know how old you are, but there was a Harvardian society.
You can guess.
Years and years ago, yeah. Well, a lot of teachers belonged to a Harvardian society in the U.S., and this is this guy that really believed that everything is apperception. Everything is a stimulus, an unconscious learning. For example, if you go into the U.S., a lot of times you're going to see classrooms that aren't as bare as this. Of course, this is university, right? Who cares? But at the same time, a lot of, if you went into an American school, one of the things you would see is the flag. That's an unconscious, because why? Unconsciously, perhaps we're adapting. If you went to Cuba, especially in the early days of Castro, you would see the flag. So that everything, you would be bombarded by stimuli that probably unconsciously you might adapt. And I believe that sometimes that kind of learning happens. That's why it was so nice to see what you were doing in terms of the effect. I'm not that creative, so all I can do is put up things. Enhance versus detract. If you are going to affect somebody, if you are going to have an effect, and coaches do, I hope it's positive. I hope you're enhancing that person's life, not detracting from it. I once interviewed a whole lot, especially females, female Olympians. And they came back and I said, I want to talk about your experience. And I said, tell me about the Olympics, tell me about your engagement in it, and tell me about afterward. And I would get a story often like this. This came from a gymnast. Well, I just finished, and I thought I did really, really well. I didn't. I was nowhere near the finals, but I did well. She said, I got really good scores, and I felt great, and I was here. Now, I don't know how many of you are Olympians here. I am not. But if I were an Olympian, I'd remember. And that would be a high point in my life. And I said, So you felt really good, you did this, now what? She said, well then it's time to party. And she said it was over. I did about 4 different disciplines. Finally it's over, I feel good about myself, and now I go, and most Olympians and most Paralympic and Olympic villages have got a lot of activities going on. So there's a lot of celebration going on, and there should be. So she said I went down to the disco, or the pub, the disco at this particular time, because it was at that age. And she said, I was having a ball, and then my coach came. And he says, what are you doing? She said, well, I'm finished, and now I'm celebrating. And he said, how can you? He said, how can you celebrate? He said, you finished 35th. How could you even leave your room? Aren't you devastated? Well, she went from here to here. So what do you think she remembers about the Olympic Games? So she went back to her room crying. Because somebody didn't think she did well enough. And I know there's a lot of pressure to win, and I know that. And I've been involved in pretty high-level events. But I don't want to enhance, or I don't want to detract from a person's experience. I want to enhance it. So I don't want it to be negative, I want it to be positive. The reason why I was interviewing them is because I was writing, I had known about this, and I was writing a book about the athlete is used as loser. And Bruce Kidd said, don't do that, Earl. Don't do that. Because what I was doing was citing a lot of great positions where the athletes should feel good about themselves and were torn down. Bruce Ogilvie and Tom Tutko in the 70s and the 80s, they used to argue that, you know how you make a national program? You make a national program because you've got enough strength to get rid of the craziness that the coaches give you and the abuse. If you can handle the abuse, then you can make it. Holy mackerel. Maybe that's what it was, but I hope that's not what it is. Primary participant. If you look at social psychology or sociology of sport, and if you study those things, you know that the primary, and you look at role behavior in sport, the only primary participant, the only primary role is the participant. The only primary role is the participant. The only primary role is the player. It's not the coach, and it's not the manager, and it's not the promoter. The only one is the player. I'm secondary. I'm an important secondary, but I'm secondary. Because the participant is why we're there. So many coaches, what's your record? My record is 32-2. Great. But you didn't do one of those events. Your team won the game for you. And so I really think we've got to kind of go back to realizing that the primary participant is the athlete, and we're supposed to be where the athlete is, not have them come to us. And I think that's really important too. We want to be engaged in their development, okay, where they are. If they're 8 years old and you're coaching them, you're not in the NHL, right? We know that, but it's so hard not to be. We've got to be where they are. And so I think they're the primary participant, and we're engaged in their development. And I think that's really, really important to know. And I think when you think like that, you're starting to think about the athlete in the center. That's athlete-centered. Athlete-centered to me, too, is coaching the whole person. I don't care how old they are, even when you're older, you recognize that if you're a coach, you're only a piece of that person's life. You might be an important part, but you're only a piece of their life. And it kind of, you have to kind of understand that, if they're older and they're married, and they've got children, or if they're going to school, or if they have friends, they have a life too. And sometimes I think that we forget that. And when we coach the whole person, I think we have to recognize that that person comes to us, and we cannot just ignore everything else that's going around in their lives. And so if something sometimes affects them, if you're close, you might be the one that hears about it. And that's okay. So coaching the whole person, I know that now we're talking a lot, in my sport, we talk a lot about training centers. Okay? A training center is great as long as you understand that you're taking a person and you're putting them here in a training center. You're not putting just the athlete in the training center, you're putting the whole person in. So we should actually have a law that says, if you identify an athlete, number one, you have to do something about it. Number two, you got to deal with the whole person. You can't say, well, look, the camp's only for 3 months, so leave your wife and kids there, because here's what you got to do. And I think sometimes we forget that they're more than athletes. I remember, how many of you remember seeing Mike Smith in the decathlon? Anybody? Mike Smith in the decathlon. 90s, it was the Olympics, and he was favored to medal in the deck. And it was Atlanta, and Atlanta was awful. I'm sorry, Atlanta was awful. It's supposed to be a temperate climate. Oh, geez, temperate? 100 degrees Fahrenheit? And then suddenly it was so hot it just rained like pow, just like a sheet. The only time I ever saw a track drying out while it was still raining. I don't know quite whether that's physics or not, but I'm watching this heat rise off the track, and the track is drying as it's misting still in the rain. So it's the 400 meters, it's the last event of his first day. He's doing okay. And then there's a delay. And then there's a delay. And that games basically is owned by Coca-Cola, right? Atlanta, Coke, they go together, you know? And so everywhere there was Powerade and everything else, you could just reach for it. If you were an athlete, you had it great, because all you had to do was, you had a little coin, and all you had to do was push that coin in any machine in Atlanta, and you got it, as long as it was a Coca-Cola product. And Mike was, I mean, I was watching him on television, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited for the 400 meters. And he would generally be running the 400 meters well under 50 seconds, like 48, 47 seconds. And he ran probably the worst 400 he'd run since high school. And he had a lot of time to think about it. He had a lot of time, and it was the press all over him. You know, the press was all over him. And then he said something that was really interesting, because they kept saying, you know, aren't you, you know, isn't this the worst thing that could happen to you? Isn't, you know, are you finished now? God, he just ran a bad race. It's like he robbed a bank or something. All he did was run a bad race. And that's what he said, you know what? He says, I'm the same person now than I was before I ran that race. And I know I ran a bad race, and nobody knows more than I do that I ran a bad race, but I'm still Mike Smith. And that's just a race. And I thought, man, is he ever put together? Is he ever psychologically put together? And he went and continued on, but obviously his chances at a medal were gone. He had 5 more events, but they were gone. And the thing is, he was strong enough to be able to say, I'm still who I am. I mean, think about it, guys. I just talked to you about a javelin camp. What significance is throwing the javelin 75 meters? Who cares? Of what significance is it running around a damn track in 47 seconds? Like, man, we celebrate this like they're superhuman, and then we go and we do what we do, and we go to work. And we do real things. And somehow we forget that they're real people. You know, I'm going through it right now with Pistorius, right? I guess we're all watching that pretty interestingly. Neat guy. Oh man. Oh man. Who still comes to the track meets in Ontario? Who still goes to the high school meets? Ben Johnson. Ben's still there. he can now walk in public. But Jesus, when they announced, I was praying, Ben, that it was going to happen. And so when they announced about doping, it's like he committed a crime. It's like he robbed a bank or shot somebody. He took steroids. And that is something, you don't want to do that. But we've got to deal with the whole person. And I think that athlete-centered coaching does. You've got to understand who's in front of you. And the other thing, too, is you have to learn, I think, when you're working with the whole person, to share your athlete. Eventually, it comes to a stage where maybe that athlete needs more than you. Maybe if that athlete is at a certain level where maybe he needs somebody, maybe you don't have time if you're coaching 6 or 8 other athletes or 20 other athletes to maybe be doing strength programs for every single one of them. But maybe they need somebody that they can go to. And you're the person that can help them. So I tend to see athlete-centered coaching as coaching the whole person. And, but still, coaching. What does it mean to me? It means the engagement's the end result. And I think it was already mentioned. Goal setting. I think you're going to have a lot more success with athletes if you set certain goals. And you set them together. Eventually you reach a certain point in time where if you listen to the athlete, you find out, and then sometimes they need help in setting goals. They need really help. I had a kid come to me, I just moved down to New Brunswick 4 years ago. I had a guy come to me, he'd never thrown a shot before. I want to go to the Olympics in a shot. And I said, okay, you're 18 years old, you're starting now, you're in university, which means if you go to the university, you've got to throw a 7.3 kilo shot. You've never thrown a 6 kilo or a 5 kilo or a 4 kilo. So you're starting right at the top. I want to do this. I want to do this so bad. And I said, well, let's talk about what your goals are. But he couldn't make the step. He ended up leaving the sport because he couldn't step from where he was to where he thought he could be in a couple of years. And we know from LTAD that you can't do that. That LTAD is a growth process. And if you start when you're 18, you might see some results when you're 23, 24. But he couldn't, no matter how hard we worked, he couldn't understand that he had to set a realistic goal. But they're his goals. Coaching self and others. I like to see athletes really know their sport. I think in so many professions, I think one of the things you have to do if you're a lawyer or a doctor or a coach is you build this whole jargon around you, like it's your jargon, right? That's what makes you a professional. Any lawyers in here? You ever try to understand a lawyer when they get going? And you only say slow down, and then the words they're using and all this. Well, it's the jargon of law, and that puts them in the club. And sometimes, as coaches, we get in the club. But an athlete should be able to learn. A lot of athletes really want to learn. They would love to learn what strength training is all about. So when a university kid, and they're starting strength, they'll say, well, Coach, can you do me a program? I said, let's do a program together. I said, here's who I follow. I said, there's a lot of ways to get strong. Okay? But I like this particular person. He's an academic. He's done a lot of good research in strength training. Here's the guy I like. So I'm going to design a program because I'm really influenced by this person. But then what I'd like you to do is read the book. And then, so the second year, he came to the strength where he says, Coach, he says, can I try and design my own strength program? I said, that's great. And he says, I'm going to use this reference. And I said, good. And so he did it, and he sent me it. He says, I said, now let's sit down with it, and so now you're teaching, right? You're teaching him to coach himself. Roger Bannister once felt, now he changed his mind a little bit around the 4-minute mile when he broke it. But Roger Bannister really believed that if you needed a coach, you weren't a pure athlete. You should be able to coach yourself. That's the essence of sport. Is not only are you performing, but you should know what you need, and you're the coach. He changed his mind a little bit, but I think a lot of times, if athletes really, really learn, and you can really, really help an athlete if you ask the athlete to coach that kid. A couple little techniques about that, though. If you're coaching, if you say, like I'll say to this girl, Naomi, help her in the shot. You watch from here, and you coach her. She said, you're kidding. I said, no, I'll coach her. That's when she really knows whether she knows. And she'll ask me, but if she's coaching her, and I'm going to help her, I'm going to talk to her, not the athlete. Because I want the athlete to understand that for that moment in time, this young lady is coaching this young lady. And that's when they really start to learn. So I think the fact that they can start to help other people and they can start to learn about their sport, and now a discussion goes on, right? You're engaged with the athlete. It's no longer I think and you do. It's what do you think? And we really explore it together. And I think as coaches, we got to get over this feeling like, holy cow, am I losing power? Am I losing face? No, I don't think so. I think athlete-centered coaching goes from children to elite. I think you can use strategies with kids that you can start to empower them and engage them and keep them in the sport. And those techniques work if you engage them, if you get them involved in having something to do with their own activity, with their own sport. Elite athletes the same way. Do you think Gretzky needs a coach when he played? Do you think that our greatest hockey players need a coach? And am I going to tell Wayne Gretzky how to shoot a puck, or how to skate backwards? He needs a coach, but that's not what he needs. He needs a sharer, he needs a cooperator. Sometimes your coaching is directive, other times it's shared, right? You're cooperating with it and it's shared, and you're sharing what happens afterward too. And then you plan together for the next series. And I don't think you have to, it's not very long before athletes should be planning with you their program. Inclusivity, it's got to be for everybody. Male, female, able-bodied, obviously disabled. I was a coach for 25 years before I coached my first disabled athlete, and I had no clue of disability. But she told me, Earl, I don't want a coach who understands my disability. If I want to have somebody who just understands my disability, I'll go see a doctor. I need a coach. That's when I suddenly realized, you're a coach. You coach individuals, coach them too. And after a while, it becomes bigger than that, right? Because coaching people with a disability is more than simply coaching a person. It's sending a message. It's sending a message that they're included, that they can be integrated, that maybe your society, I didn't realize, I know that I sponsored one female athlete, one disabled athlete to the Ontario Olympic Academy, or the Canadian Olympic Academy. How many members, Canadian Olympic Academy members? No? Oh, too bad. But you can still be. You can still be. It still exists. So I sent her to the Olympic Academy. She was the first athlete who with a disability who ever went. And suddenly they realized, holy God, we've been around for a long time, and not one disabled athlete's ever been invited to the Canadian Olympic Academy. And then they didn't know what to do with her. So they felt she had cerebral palsy. She walked, she was an ambulatory. So they built everything for a wheelchair. She said, I don't need a wheelchair. But the next one needed a wheelchair. And they put her on the 3rd floor. They just weren't quite tuned in yet. But I think I can't give a presentation without talking about some level of being inclusive. I was busy as a coach. So therefore I had to say to this girl, look, I was coaching at Ontario University at the time, and I said, if I'm gonna coach you, you're gonna have to come to our practices. That's perfect. And you know, the athletes had no problem with it. The athletes had no problem with it. So suddenly integration had occurred, and they started to appreciate who this person was, and appreciate that for her, 30 meters in the discus was huge. In fact, she set 3 world records that year. And the university team celebrated as much as she did. But they understood where she was. So, finally, sharing the power. I guess that's what we're really talking about if we're concerned about power. And we'll just, I think I've got one more. And so some of the things that I've tried to reflect on, mutual sharing of the sport, talk about it with them. Be prepared to dream a little bit. Because if they've got dreams and if they start to set goals, they become part of your goals too, right? Because you're the coach. That person's the center, but you are important. You drive the program. So therefore, that goal becomes your goal, right? So you're working together for that person's goal. Listen more. I'm listening a lot more to what my athletes say. I don't know if I listened 40 years ago. I don't know. You know, you coach for 5 years, you think you know it. I'm still learning. I'm still learning, and I've coached for longer than 5 years. Patience and flexibility. I think the athlete learns patience when you demonstrate patience. And I am not a patient person. But the athletes can always tell me, Doc, come on back to us. And they'll say that, you know, come on back to us, you're starting to lose us. And I had one disabled kid, and he could have been special O, but he was a Paralympian. And so we talked it over, and I said, whenever I start moving too fast for you, walk away. He'd walk away a lot. Jim, okay, I get the message. Open communication, studying the sport, sharing your own learning and stories and performances. I think that's really important. Study the sport together. Your own realistic goals about what success means, I think I've talked about that. Mutual trust, building autonomy. Autonomy is freedom. Autonomy means self-reliance. Sooner or later, the athlete leaves you. Okay? Sometimes they leave you faster than you think. And sometimes that separation has to take place because one of the reasons why you're working with them is that for that autonomy, especially if they're young. It's their growth, but you're growing too. Have fun and celebrate. To me, I used to be an X's and O's guy. Yeah, we reached that goal. Good. Next. And I never stopped to say, you know what, that was a goal. We targeted that goal 4 months ago. We reached it. Why don't we celebrate it? To me, it was just, well, that's the next step. Now we're going to go to here, instead of stopping and sharing the moment. And I think developing that human being is really, really important, because what I really want is I never want to have an athlete tell me again that I think sport was worth it. So I think I'll leave it until there are any questions later. Okay.
I don't think there's much left to say. I think these gentlemen have covered it. A lot of good information, a lot of really good information. I guess the way I'll come at this is that I've lived the life of the elite athlete for a little bit, and I've spent the last 16 years in the coaching capacity, and it's been a really interesting journey to go from the athlete and sort of how you saw the world, and then to go to the coach and how you see the world. And I often tell the athletes that it was a whole lot easier when I only had to worry about one, and that was me, as opposed to the 17 or 18 or the support staff that I work with. But Earl touched on a couple of things when he talked about Ben Johnson. I just finished reading Charlie Francis's book, Speed Trap. I don't know if you've ever read it. I had wanted to read it for a very long time, and I'd forget about it, and then I'd think of it. And so anyway, I finally went online and I found a book, and I could only buy it as a used book because it hadn't been published in years. But what a phenomenal read. Just an absolutely phenomenal read. And to read that book and understand that in today's culture, we understand that performance-enhancing drugs are illegal and they shouldn't be used, etc. But when you read that book and you understand the culture of Olympic sports in the 60s and 70s and how performance-enhancing drugs weren't illegal and how dominant they were used in Europe in particular, you really gain an appreciation for how and why it happened, not to condone it, but to understand how and why it happened, and that we really, if you're an athlete that's invested as much time in a particular sport as Ben Johnson and Desai Williams and that group did, you understand that they really didn't have a choice if they wanted to compete at that next level. So, to hear Earl talk about that and to sort of understand through the book the other pieces of it is really interesting. And you made a comment about Roger Bannister. And one of the things I coach little kids. I teach pitching in my sport in softball. Pitching was the position I played, and so every Tuesday night I work with a group of little ones through middle teens, and I'm constantly telling them about becoming their own coach. That my job is to help you learn what proper mechanics look like, what success looks like, what it feels like to do it correctly, so that when you're in the middle of a game and something isn't working, you can fix it, because the coach can't come on the field and tell you what to do. So it's interesting. Very little bit about my background. I've been involved in high performance sports since I was 19 years old, and I'm still involved to this day and coach internationally and love it. And quite honestly, probably in the last few years, for whatever the reason, have come to enjoy it even more. And whether that's me simply coming to grips with the fact that for many years in my softball, on the women's side, was an Olympic sport until 2008, and back when they moved some sports out of the Olympics, softball and baseball were removed. So I took over the program in 2009 after it had been removed from the Olympics. Prior to that, I coached the men's national team for 10 years, and we were not an Olympic sport. So I've lived that double life that I'm sure most of you do, where you work by day and you coach and train from a distance by night and weekends and that sort of thing. And I've always found it to be a tough transition, because you kind of have your work head and your family life and all those things, and then you get on a plane and you go for 6 or 7 weeks and you try to immerse yourself in coaching, and it's been a struggle by times, but I'm in a place now where I think I'd like to think I've better got it figured out. When I think about athlete-centered coaching, to touch on the comments that both Alan and Earl have so nicely spoken to earlier, I mean, to me it's very much about making the athlete the center of the universe. And one of the things that I've always thought about is that as a parent, the goal is to raise our kids to be prepared for life and independent and socially and morally competent. But yet if you look at our coaching models in North America, almost every instance it's about the coach in charge telling everybody else what to do. And it's almost as though we don't give the athlete credit that they can figure it out for themselves. And a really interesting story, when I took over the women's team in 2009, and I was coaching the men's team that summer as well, so for about a 12-week block I would spend a few weeks with the men, and then I'd get on a plane and go train with the women, and then I'd go back and go train with the men, and then I'd go back and train with the women. Very interesting dynamics. But what really stuck out with me was I very much believe in the athlete taking ownership and taking responsibility and making decisions that impact the outcome of a game on their own, because I believe they're capable of that. And I coach young women who are between the ages of 16, 17, and 29 or 30. So, they're at an age where they clearly are capable of making those decisions for themselves. So when I talked about my philosophy with the group and what expectations were and the type of offense we were going to play and the aggressiveness that we were going to make as part of the culture of how we would do things, I often told the girls, listen, if you hit a ball in the gap, that means in the outfield towards the fence between the outfielders, you hit a ball in the gap, you decide whether it's a double or a triple. You don't need me to tell you how fast you can run and how far you can get. You've played the game however many years, you know that. Because as a boy growing up, you eventually learned those skills. You knew when you could take a risk, you knew when you couldn't take a risk, you had a pretty good sense of what you could or you couldn't do, and you kind of based your game around those primers. Well, this went on for about a week and a half, and then one of the captains, who was about 27 years old, two-time Olympian, comes knocking on my hotel room door, and she says, "Coach, can I talk to you for a minute?" Absolutely, and we come in, and she says, "Listen, I got to start by telling you that we really appreciate what you're trying to do here, like we do. We get it that you are trying to empower us. We get it that you want us to make our own decisions. We get it that you're okay with us taking some risk. But you need to understand where we come from with this. You know, from the time we're 13, 14 years of age, we have played for coaches who have constantly made every decision on the field that we do. We are told what to do at every step, whether it's calling pitches from the dugout in terms of which pitch a pitcher throws, to how many bases we take when the ball is hit. I mean, we have constantly been programmed to listen and do. And then if we're lucky enough to get an NCAA scholarship and we go to school, now we really don't have any say. Because those coaches are all, you know, your livelihood is based on the performance of 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and they leave very little to chance. So they are very much going to dictate how things are done. So she said, you know, literally, we go through about a 10-year period where we don't have to think about anything, because the coach does it for us. And so most of us are at that place now where we don't want to think about it. It's a lot easier for you to tell us than it is for us to figure it out. So we're not, you know, we appreciate what you're doing, but could you please just tell us what you want us to do, you know? And so we deferred to that for the rest of that season, because that took the stress off the athlete. That's not my philosophy, and I don't believe in that, but I felt that that's what made us better for that period of time. But we have now slowly, as a coaching staff, moved more and more towards them owning things without them really knowing it. So we don't talk about it as much. We just constantly ask questions, put them in positions to give us feedback, and what they are doing without knowing is they're taking more and more ownership of their own performance. And I believe very much that that's the approach that we need to take. Alan and Earl have touched on these things, but for me it starts with creating that positive learning environment. So making sure that they can ask questions, that they aren't going to get their heads chewed off because it's expected that they know. Giving them a chance to tell you what they think, how they do things, why they do it that way. We try very much to ask for their input. We have a leadership group within our national team. We have 5 athletes that are part of the program. They range from a couple of our best athletes to a couple of athletes that make the team one year and get cut the next. And I do that intentionally because I want there to be a cross-section of personalities and leadership on that group that every other athlete that's part of our team feels like they can relate to. So the new kid probably relates a little better to the kid who's the 16th, 17th player, whereas the more established players might relate a little better to the players who play every day. But I want there to be a personality and somebody that everybody feels that they've got something in common with, that they can talk to, be mentored by, or simply go and have a conversation with if they're feeling uncomfortable with something. We try to ask a lot of open-ended questions. You know, when you swing at this pitch and you get this result, what does that feel like? Or from a pitching perspective, when you release the ball in this position and it ends up in this particular location, what do you think you just did? Where was your body? How did that feel? What would you change? Because we want them to constantly bring it back to, what am I doing? How do I make the adjustment so that when they're in a real game situation, they have a point of reference. They can make that adjustment on their own because we've done this enough times now that they realize they have the skills to make those decisions. Empowering them, giving them the opportunity to try different things. It's okay to get thrown out at third base if you think you can get to third on a ball that's hitting the outfield. Certainly we don't want that to happen in a game of significance, but if we're playing in regular play, in regular round-robin play, and you want to risk going from second to third, or from first to third, or from second to home, it's okay. How do you know if you can do it if you don't take a risk and try to? And if you do happen to make a mistake or you get thrown out, then we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the situation. We'll talk about whether it was a good thing to have done. Would you do it again? What are the things you're going to look for the next time? What are the cues that tell you whether you think you can or you think you can't? Because one of the things, again, that I've learned as a young male is that because we played so much unstructured ball when I was a kid, you took all of these risks every day after school and every Saturday and Sunday with your buddies. And you figured these things out with no coaches and no adults, and by the time you could take that to an organized game, you had a pretty good handle on what you could or couldn't do. Most girls have never had that exposure. So everything they've done has been in a structured environment. So they haven't got to take those risks and get over making the mistake or understanding what cues allow them to know if they can or they can't. So that was a learning for me, because certainly I can tell you, my wife, who was a former Olympic athlete, she traveled with me the first 3 weeks that I coached the women's team. And I can remember a couple of nights going back to my hotel room going, I don't know if I can do this. Because my expectations of what they could do was so much higher than they should have been because I had coached them. You know, bigger, stronger, faster, more life experience in the game, just a completely different animal. And that was my point of reference for 19 years as a player and another 10 as a coach. So when I go from that to coaching younger females who clearly don't have that skill set and clearly can't play to that performance level, in my mind, that's where I'm trying to get them. And what I did find out over time is that I was being unrealistic. I maybe could get them a quarter of the way there or halfway there, and in some things all the way there. But I had to rethink my expectations, because otherwise I was going to come up disappointed a lot because they just couldn't do those things. And I didn't have enough time with them to ever get them to that point, and probably in reality they never could get to that point. So it forced me to have to reevaluate. Communicating on a level they understand. When my little 7-year-old and 8-year-old comes into pitch, you know, I talk to her about the things of the day that are important to her. When my 12 and 13-year-olds come into pitch, we talk about boyfriends because they get a real rise out of that. And when my 17 and 18-year-olds come into pitch, we talk about cars, movies, going to school, scholarships, and all of those things. I very much try to find things that relates to them at their level so that they see me as a friend, first and foremost, because I want the lessons we do to be fun. Yes, they're going to learn some skills, but I want them to leave there, had a good time, like Mark, enjoy the time I spend with them. I'm getting something from it in addition to just learning how to throw a ball. That has always been important to me, and I hope it will always be important to me. But understanding them at their level really matters. And then, of course, the importance of reinforcing the positives. You know, kids know, you know, when we screw up, no one has to tell us. They know when things aren't going well, but they need to hear more often when things are going well, and the good stuff they do. As Earl talked about, celebrating successes. I probably was one of the worst for that. In my mind, it was all about always pushing the envelope, always being the best, always challenging yourself, and expecting nothing less than that. So if you accomplish something that you should have accomplished because it's a rung on the ladder to the end, to the top, what's there to be excited about? There's still 5 rungs to go. That might have been how I was wired, but that's not how a lot of the kids I coach are wired. So I have to step back and understand that while in my mind, there's still work to be done, let's recognize the good work they've done to get there, because that's part of motivating them to try to take that next step or the next risk. And I think that's really important. Now, the challenges to this approach, without a doubt, are time. You know, it is so much easier sometimes to just direct people to do things and give kids the answers than it is to problem solve and give them a chance to figure the answers out themselves. So for sure, there's a patience aspect. Athletes' expectations. Many of the athletes today expect you to tell them. That's what mom and dad are paying you for, or that's why you're there, because you have the answers. Why do I have to know if you already know? So creating that environment where they want to ask, they want to learn, they feel it's part of what they get from the experience, you're making them more independent. It takes some time to change that around, because that's not necessarily what they're accustomed to. Our traditional attitudes and values around coaching, I've dealt with lots and lots of coaches over the years in minor sport, and there's absolutely no question that sometimes we are the problem. You know, I said to, maybe it was Alan earlier today when we were talking about tonight, when you grew up as kids in whatever sport you played, and probably this may apply more to the guys in the room than the women, when you went out and played pickup anything, usually the 2 best athletes there were the captains, and everybody else got picked, right? And if it looked like the teams were going to be unfair, somebody usually spoke up and said, no, no, Mark, you should be on that team, and you should be on this team. And we played for hours, and nobody griped, and nobody worried about the score because it was fair, and we were all having fun. But you interject an adult into the mix who's got their own values and their own expectations and their own reasons for being there and their own agendas, and all hell breaks loose. And we see it in minor sports. Hockey's probably the one that takes the hit worse, and our province, soccer's not far behind. You know, because it stops being about the kids, and it starts being about the affluence. It starts being about who's going to make it to the regional training center, who's going to get a shot to play on the travel team. It starts being about everything other than the purity of competition and the opportunity for kids to have a chance to play. And it is the adults that affect that, not the kids. And parental attitudes. I can remember the very first time my daughter, who's now in university, was about 8 at the time, maybe 7. And we lived in a community where there wasn't any minor softball, and so some of my friends that I worked with, and we all had kids around the same age, started to put a little heat on me about, you know, you ought to be volunteering and having a minor ball team. And so anyway, fair enough. So now I'm going to coach this group of 7 or 8-year-olds a couple of nights a week. And I'm scared to death. Because I'm thinking, at this time, I'm still competing, and I'm thinking, what the heck do I know about 7 or 8-year-olds? I've got one here now that I'm trying to figure out on a daily basis. So I remember sitting down at the kitchen table with our daughter, saying, what kind of games do you guys play at recess? You know, and what time is it Mr. Wolf and freeze tag and all of these, because I'm trying to build a little bit of a practice plan, but I know that at the age group, the last thing I can afford to do is lose their attention. So I've got to find things that I know they're going to like to do, and then I can mix in a little bit of skill stuff, and you know, and as long as at the end of the day there's popsicles and freezies, it's all good, right? So this is what I'm doing. I got my practice plans going, I got my popsicles and freezies, we've got them running, we got water balloons, we got them running bases backwards, and you know, probably if we're there an hour and 15 minutes, 20 minutes to a half an hour of it is games and fun activities, half an hour of it is some kind of a modified game activity, and the last little bit is, you know, having a popsicle and high-fiving, and away we go. And I think the second session that I had, this mother chases me to the parking lot when I've got the gear going to my car, and she says, I need to ask you something. I said, okay. She says, what do you think of my son? Now I have no idea who your son is. He was about 16. I said, well, which boy is your son? Well, that's him over there. And I said, oh, you know, I remembered his name, and I said, oh, you know, he looked like he was having fun today. I don't know, right now. And she says, well, you know, everybody's been telling me he's got this wicked arm and he ought to be playing in such and such a league and he's going to be a really good baseball player. And she says, I just want to know, like, you know, what do you think? And I said, ma'am, like, I'm here to make sure they have fun and learn some skills. I said, quite honestly, this is non-competitive. This is about the kids learning some skills. I said, they're out here every Wednesday night. They seem to be having a ball. They are learning, you know, how to do different things. I said, I'm not in a position to assess how good a player your son is at this stage. So she says, well, next week, you know, can you? So, yeah, okay. So next week comes and, you know, the little boy shows up and I'm watching him and, you know, he's having the same, I call it fetch, not catch, because I throw it over Derek's head and then Derek throws it over my head and I go get it and then I throw it back over Derek's head and every now and then I catch it. You know, that's kind of the game. And he's no better, no worse. He's middle of the pack like everybody else, having fun, doing some things really well, struggling with other things. And at the end of the night, here she comes again. And, you know, I had to explain to her that at 8 years of age, I didn't have a crystal ball to be able to tell her where her boy was going to end up in baseball, but that he was welcome to come, and as long as he had a good experience, and I never saw her or the kid again. You know, and it was my first experience with that unrealistic expectation that parents have of kids, and that we as coaches have to still find a way to make sure that at the end of the day, we're serving every kid and not just you know, the ones that want the special attention. So you know, this is sort of the Coles Notes version. I think these two gentlemen did a wonderful job of capturing the essence of the athlete-centered coaching piece. But you know, what I would say to you as coaching colleagues is that the most important thing we can do, I believe, is make sure that the kids in our charge have a good experience. If they go on to play at a higher level, that's great. And we certainly want to do everything in our ability levels to help them make that next step. But I see myself, even as a national team coach, as developing the whole person. I've got 5 athletes on my team that are NCAA Division I coaches. And we have a lot of fun talking about the coaching piece. In fact, just yesterday I got an email from a young lady that cut one of her players, and she had to sit down yesterday with the AD, the assistant AD, the compliance officer, mom and dad, because everybody's pissed because the kid got cut. And she's emailing me and she's saying, Coach, you know, I don't know what to do, and you know, I did this and I did that, and so we had a conversation last night on the telephone about, you know, making sure that you're keeping notes and making sure that things are done in a way that you're always recording. When you recognize that you're starting to have some challenges with athletes, do you keep notes? And do you sit down and talk to the athletes about it? It was a great teachable moment, because they're young women that have been moved into coaching ranks who in some cases are learning as they go, and depending on the program they're in, some of them have been promoted to head coach positions, and quite honestly, they're not quite experienced enough to be head coaches, but they're in the roles. And so in addition to coaching them as my national team athletes, I'm now kind of getting to mentor them as coaches in the profession. And one of them, who used to be just a royal pain in my ass, to be completely honest with you, who's really kind of turned a corner in the last few years around maturity, I called her last week about something, and we were talking about this leadership group, and we wanted her to become a part of the leadership group, and she said, you know, Coach, it is so nice to get a phone call when I'm not getting ragged out because I messed up. You know, and we kind of chuckled about that because 2 years ago, that's what the phone call would have been about, right? Something she didn't do that she should have done. So to see her kind of go full circle and now understand that as a coach, and we had a training session in Miami the 1st of January, she was there. Welcome to our It's interesting, but you know, the job you do is invaluable. It really is, and the kids appreciate you being there, and I'm sure the parents appreciate you being there too, although you may not always you can understand more to life than just the sport they play, and that it really is about making the experience everything it can be for them.
And we talk about the calendar always being athlete-centered, but you know, there's a lot of us starting to question, and I'm kind of encouraged by some of the words you've said about what one of the things we've been talking about, a couple of us, is, you know, well, what do our kids really want? Like as athletes in skiing, I don't know if we have 2 of them in Atlantic Canada that really want to be on the national team. So what are we trying to accomplish, right? So any thoughts or any feedback on, maybe you've had experience in creating, you know, whether it's a competition schedule or a season schedule of events, and still keeping it athlete-centered. So in skiing, we are challenged by the weather. So of course, we are a very short season in Atlantic Canada, probably 10 weeks, and you're trying to fit in some races. You've got different age categories. It's a bit of a nightmare sometimes. So I'm just looking for any thoughts or feedback you might have on maybe some key things that we should keep in mind when we're trying to do this. We're, you know, of course, we're looking at costs and school and how do we play with all that. So I'm open to any thoughts.
How many, when we talk about, it's got to be more than competition, right? If you're in the train-to-train area, or even the learn-to-train, it sounds to me
And I would say that's probably exactly where we are in those 2 groups. Yeah.
And that's where we are. If we're working in high schools, a lot of schools, or if they're not, and if they're late developing sports. And I don't know if skiing is, but I think the thing is to keep them occupied with the challenges of the hill itself, and not to worry so much about engaging in competitions. And I don't know whether that's helping you to begin with. And all kinds of creative activities. Maybe coaching each other. Maybe working in pairs. Do you always train on the same hill?
As a club, so pretty well, yeah. Well, not always. It depends in the season. Early in the season, we go away because there's no snow here. But once the season is here, we tend to stay at our hill and train. We do have camps here and there, and so we do move around a little bit in that sense.
Is there any off-hill? What do you do when you're not skiing, but you're still in the sport?
Some clubs have dry land, other clubs don't. It just depends on sometimes on the location of where their athletes are. So the club I ski out of Sussex, we have kids from, you know, Moncton, St. John's, so it's a little more of a challenge for us to do dry land, whereas here they do. So they meet once or twice a week, I think, and they do.
Well, to me, I think it's vary your practice, and I don't know if you try to go out of season. I don't know if that's if your season is 3 months or whatever it is, that's different than saying trying to organize a yearly plan.
Yeah.
You know, but I would just say variation, and I think the worst thing I'm noticing is I don't like competing against the same person all the time. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in the U.S., and I'll just talk about the U.S. for a second because they're crazy there. Everything is about your record, right? And everything is about the team's record. So, you know, this team is 4-0 or 10-0 or whatever it is, right? So, the hard part, and I'm finding it here, is we're always competing against the same 2 or 3 people all the time. Even if we put the maritime provinces together, you've got these 4 athletes and they're always seeing each other. And there might be interesting stuff. I know what archery did. Archery had a real problem too, because there aren't a lot of archers to this country. So they started setting up competitions by remote. So they would have a BC club and a Toronto club would be competing in their own area, and they'd be using filming. So they'd be creating competitions that are separate, and they'd be somehow working out ways that they can engage each other by, and then you got to be creative, but that's the fun in it. So if you wanted to have that, you could maybe find, the problem with that too is skiing down the same kind of hill,
yeah,
right?
the terrain's not the same.
So, but all I can suggest is to be creative, but find other people to engage. Because I think after a while, it gets boring.
My other comment to you would be is, you know, does your club, does everybody understand what everybody's signed up for?
Well, and this is a question I've been raising a lot in the last little bit, so I'm really kind of now really engaged to move forward with this thought is, you know, I jotted down some of the questions you asked, Alan. I love that little task you gave them of giving 140 characters. Our athletes are going to do that, and that's, I know you met with Michelle this morning, that's a conversation Michelle and I have a lot is that do we even know what our athletes, like, you know, because we keep talking, oh, this, and I'm like, guys, like, I don't think we're here. Like, I think our kids, you know, because there's a big talk, and Nova Scotia went through it in the last year, they lost a lot of athletes. That happens after Canada Games. And there's this big uproar of how do we keep our athletes? And the reality to me, I kind of go, sometimes I think, why do we want to keep them past high school? Maybe that's all they want, and then they want to coach. What's so bad about that? So I think there is sort of this conversation that I think we need to have as a sport of where, what are we all about?
Well,
right?
You know, one of the things I do in Nova Scotia is I meet with all the Canada Games sports and on their preparation plans for the next games and their coaching plans, etc. And we met with Alpine 2 weeks ago. And what really struck me, I don't know a lot about the sport, but what really struck me is that, you know, in order for a kid from our part of the country to excel,
they have to be. Yeah, bottom line.
And it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so I'm sitting and I'm listening to a committee of people, all of whom are business people, all of whom have pretty deep pockets, all of whom, one parent was very quick to say, last year I spent $70,000 on my kid to ski, and I'm thinking, good for you. But that's not realistic,
No.
right? So, I mean, sometimes it's asking the hard questions, but the reality is that if skiing in our part of the world is about 3 to 4 months long, with a trip thrown in on the front end to find snow and a trip thrown in on the back end, that's what it is. And for those that want to sign up for that, let's go at it as best we can and be realistic about where we can go with the limited time on snow we have. And for the ones that want more, they got to move to where the mountains are.
Yeah.
And sometimes people don't want to hear that, but
Yeah.
that's reality.
That's a realistic issue though in all sport. And I've been involved in curling. They start out with little rocks and say there's 100 children in the Fredericton area starting. It comes to juniors and there's 60. It comes to the second unit of juniors or third, and now there's 40. And some mention has been that possibly, and one of you gentlemen discussed like the competitive versus the fun, both being intertwined in the same program. I don't know if that's the issue or not, but I know it's an issue in a lot of sports, how do you maintain and keep that young child involved in a longer time? I mean, in curling, they can enjoy curling at any age, at any level, for the rest of their life. So how do we lose them? And so that.
But I guess my question was always back to the sport. Have you ever done a survey to the high school or the university age kid? I'm almost of the belief, and I spent 10 years working in sport development before I took this position, that there's a natural attrition that happens with sport. You know, kids get to the age of 17, 18, and they go to university, and if they aren't good enough to be a varsity athlete, or maybe their sport isn't at university, they have to work a part-time job, they have to work a summer job, reality kicks in, and it's no more fun and games. Mom and dad aren't paying the bill anymore. And so they have choices to make. And I suspect that that is what happens to 75% of them. And so it's a natural fall-off point, because for the next 4 years, it's about getting an education to set up the rest of their lives. Now, if they've had a good experience in sport, my belief is that they trickle back to it once they get out, get a job, and they can, they can have a means of supporting themselves. They often tend to find their way back to that sport in some capacity.
In our sport, I think we're losing them too young, like from that 11-year-old to the 12-year-old to the junior part. We're losing a massive amount there. So anyways, specific to that sport, but I hear.
But I think a great place to start with is asking kids and families why. And I think sometimes that's a piece of this puzzle we forget. We as the managers of the sport or the guardians of the sport tend to sometimes feel like we're the ones that have to come up with the answers, as opposed to asking the end user, what is it? Maybe it's because, nothing against curling, maybe it's because it's not physical enough. Maybe those kids want to play a basketball or a volleyball or something that's a little more labor intensive in terms of physical activity. Not that they don't like curling, but they might enjoy trying something like that a little bit more. But until the questions are asked, you never know.
And I think that's a reality too, that we should be encouraging kids to do a lot of things. And I think, if we look at our sport, and that's why it's a 3-month sport, they're engaged for 3 months. Great. If you can keep them engaged for 3 months, that's what they did. They experienced it. And I still think, keep in mind the fact that you're affecting them. And if they're having fun, and I hate this, because sometimes fun is a word that we just kind of, we use that as a general term, like everybody go have fun and everything will be good, but we know out of that, some athletes want to learn. But I still think if we recognize that we're just one little piece in a person's life, and I would love to think, my son, I thought for sure my son was going to be a great javelin thrower, because I started having him throw the javelin when he was about 8 years old, and he was a lefty, and I thought that was a problem with me right off the bat, because he threw this javelin weird, and he finally said to me, Dad, I don't really like javelin. I said, okay, well that's fine, because we were just throwing in the backyard. But he became a pitcher. And that had value to him because he had fun. But he didn't want to play sport. He didn't want to play that game all the time. So he played basketball. And then he came to me and wanted to play hockey. I didn't even want him to play hockey. I said, you got to give me 3 good reasons why you play hockey. And if you can give me 3 good reasons why you should play hockey, then I'll consider it. And he gave me 3 really good reasons, so what am I going to do? So he played hockey. 4 years later, I said, well, are you going to play hockey this time, Jordan? He said, no. He says, I had a great time. It was 4 years of my life. I really enjoyed it. It was great, but I don't want to play anymore. And sometimes I think that's all there needs to be. So you probably got them more engaged than you think you do. And then inspire them to do something else afterwards. Okay, what are you going to do in the spring? When it melts, it's hard to ski. And I think that we should be sharing. I think some of the biggest problems that I see in youth sport is too much. Like I see kids. I call them camp kids. They're playing. They're going to a skills camp in August or in July for hockey. And I know damn well, like parents are paying like $800 for that kid to go for 4 days, and they think it's because their kid is really good. Because the other guys are making a living. That's how they're doing it. And I don't know if I think that we should, you're probably doing more than you think you're doing. I guess what I'm trying to say is, that's where, if that's where skiing is, that's probably where most kids are anyway. You know, I don't see a lot of, and we talk about losing kids along the way. A lot of times we lose the kids along the way because we're not doing participation anymore. We're doing sport. As a head of physical education in a school, in a couple of schools, I found there's a real problem, a real reciprocity between your teams and intramurals. And I found that the teams wanted the gym all the time, but intramurals was supposed to be important. And so suddenly you were giving up the gym for 12 kids. And all these kids wanted to come in and do is shoot baskets. That's all they wanted to do. And if all you did was open the gym for the kids to come in and shoot baskets and do their pickup games, you'd have 40 kids in the gym. And I think sometimes we overstructure. And instead of just letting it happen. And understand too, if they make a choice, and if it's a legitimate choice that they want to try something else, then I think let them try. And I wouldn't lose too much sleep out of the fact that we lose a lot of kids. I think that we lose them maybe to something else. And that something else that maybe is important is
As long as they're involved in something.
as long as they're doing,
Yeah, absolutely.
you know, and they won't forget. And you gave them a memory. And as far as I'm concerned, because I believe in effect, so I believe you've changed them. I believe you've had a positive effect on this kid for 3 months. And even if they don't realize it, they'll realize it in time. And I think that's really, really important. So I wouldn't get over the fact that we've got to have a yearly training plan for a 15-year-old. And I would just, and I don't necessarily, I'm fairly new to the Maritimes, but I do not agree that I think there's tremendous talent down here. I think it's amazing talent. They just don't know it. But I'm seeing kids perform like, wow. And I, maybe not so many, maybe, you know, for Ontario there might be 10 high jumpers that can do, and 1 high jumper here, but there is talent here. And I think that if we don't push it and we let it evolve, I really believe that it'll happen. It really will happen. And I know that they do have to go away eventually, because I don't think because necessarily the coaching or I think it's because you need to be where your competitors are. And it's expensive to travel around. I mean, we're going through that right now where if we want to have beyond the train to train, that requires, if you look at your LTAD documents and you go beyond the train to train, now you start punching in facility, and now you start punching in coaching, and now you start punching in competition and where, and I think it becomes a really, really expensive enterprise. And maybe they do have to move, or maybe we have to be creative and think about how, if they're worth it, how do we do that? And I don't know. I think everybody struggles with that, with dollars. But I just talked to a group about 3 weeks ago about, and it was a critical mass. There was about 30 kids or 30, 40 kids who were interested in Canada Games in Brunswick. There comes a point where you have to make a decision as an athlete. The athlete says, am I committed enough? Am I finally there where I want to make this commitment, or am I still saying, no, I like to dabble, I like to play in a lot of things, which is good too. But making a commitment sometimes is really difficult. And I told them the story about a figure skater. And she was young, but figure skaters are young. And finally the coach asked her, they said, you know, we need to have a meeting with your parents. And so they came in and they talked to the parents, and they said, you know, your daughter could be a really, really good figure skater. I mean, we're talking about a really good figure skater here. And they said, okay. And they said, but, and there was the but. If she's going, and she said, she's going to be a pair skater. She's not going to be a single. She's going to be a pair skater. We can see it right now. In fact, we know who her partner will be. She was about 15, 16. We know who her partner in pairs will be. Oh, really? Yeah. And they're just a really good fit, and we see this happening. And then they said, but she's going to have to move away to another rink because this is where we would like them to be. And she's going to need at least 4 or 5 outfits, and she's going to need the skates to go with it. And the skates cost, what, $600 to $800 a piece. And then she's going to have to travel. So at least the coaches who talked to the parents laid out the world for them. And they said, but the choice is yours. But you have a prodigy here. You have a very gifted child. And you make up your mind what you're going to do. And then they said, well, geez, we got to have a family meeting. So they brought in the girl skater, and they brought in her brother, and the father and mother got around. And father said, well, you know, I'll work overtime, and I'll see if I can get a second mortgage on the house. And the mother said, well, I'll start working. I'll start working again. All for their daughter. And the kid said, I'll take a paper route. And the young girl saying, like, this is a collective. This family is making this commitment. Now that girl could have gone and broken her ankle and had been finished in 3 weeks. 2 years later, she won the Worlds. Quite a story, and it's a wonderful ending. But it didn't have to end like that. It could have ended anyway. But it's about choices and commitment and taking a chance. And sometimes I'd like to encourage us kids, especially, to take a little bit of a chance sometimes. In anything. In anything. And I don't know. But I do know that it takes huge commitments when you get past the train-to-train stage. And it takes a big hill. It takes a big hill in
It
skiing.
doesn't take a big hill, it takes a lot of athletes.
The sports psychologist, where do they fit into the whole scheme of things?
I don't know. Like I do know. But I think that, you know, we're getting into, I think the way to introduce IST, okay, integrated support team, which is a lot of scientists, and you've got some great ones in this province tonight. Ken Seaman is brilliant. I think this guy is probably one of the finest strength conditioning coaches on understanding strength conditioning that I've ever had, and I've ever worked with. And I've worked with like 50 years. And this guy blows me away. And he's here. But when do you start integrating integrated sport, an integrated system? I think you start by having them go to things like this, where they might hear a psychologist. Like right now in Toronto this weekend, Peter Jensen's speaking. God, I want to be there, but I can't because I've got to be somewhere else. But so you go and you hear somebody like this, and you start to get, or you read his book, you know, his latest one, Igniting the Third something. I can't remember. But I think you start by that, and as a coach, part of your job is to try to bring these people on when you're needed. And I think that you have to really be careful with that, and you have to introduce them to the concept of the role of what a sports psychologist does, and let that just unfold. I don't know whether there's a way, but I think that if you're a Canada Games coach, I think you should be introducing your athletes to integrated support, even if it's by attending a lecture as an introduction to strength training or to nutrition or to sports psychology and to all these avenues. And I think at that level, at the Canada Games level, I think that every group should be at least hearing about these things, because we're educating the athlete that way.
In Nova Scotia, it's part of our Canada Games preparation. There's 2 sports psychologists that work with our teams. There's 2, the strength and conditioning as well as nutrition. And so the coaches are introduced to it first, and then they get the supports team a bit of a flavor for the groups they have, but we also have a number of provincial teams that pay for that service. And so it starts off as a very basic introductory to what is mental performance, so that the kids get a real Coles Notes version of understanding what it is and how you integrate that into your everyday training and the mental imagery pieces and those sorts of things. Because for a lot, it's kind of black magic. It's not tangible. You can't touch mental training. How do you know that you're more mentally prepared than the person sitting next to you? So it's introducing them to what it is, and that ability to prepare, the ability to block out distractions and understand what it is to be focused, and to be able to let go of negative performance and positive self-talk and those sorts of things. So we now are integrating those things into our Canada Games. It's not a mandatory piece, but what we've told our sports is that if you don't take part in it starting, I think it's about 18 months out from the games, at the games themselves, when we have those people there, you can't do that.
So you're saying 18 months, sort of. I've tried to introduce, I started with a group a couple of years ago, and when they were 12, getting them ready for this next Canada Games, and that's why I'm here. I've subjected them or opened the book to mental rehearsal and all those things on their own, but like you were talking about introducing them to all the Canada Games competitors, but we haven't chosen who that will be yet, so none of that's available here unless we.
Okay. We have it so that it's the maximum number is groups of 20. Is groups of 20. So you don't have to have your final roster selected. We just can't accommodate more than 20 athletes for a particular team. So it can be your core team, if it's 20 or less, that get the exposure, which is advantageous because even the kids that may not continue on to the games get an exposure to mental performance.
You allow outsiders?
It's here. It's here. You don't need to go to Nova Scotia.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm your contact for that, just for the record. We have a Canada Games Sports Science program in New Brunswick. That's all.
No, I know.
Yeah.
One thing, the biggest thing that I've dealt with ISTs and especially sports psych, which I haven't really, I'm still getting into my role here in New Brunswick and haven't really utilized that here for the team. We have Canada Games, but I have universities in the past, and getting the athletes familiar with it is the most important thing. You can't just, when I did my level 3, I just read in a book and I thought, okay, great, we'll do this before the championship event. It was great, and we did visualization and everyone was feeling okay, we're gonna go out and win, and then they came 6th. And then everyone was crushed because they visualized themselves winning, and it was a really good lesson for everyone in what not to do. But just after that point, I started doing it earlier, and even earlier, and then doing it in preseason camp, and having weeks of preparation and just practice makes it a whole lot better. Integrating visualization into practice, things like that, it's a really big difference.
John, do you have a question?
Just to kind of switch gears a little bit to a management focus of this conversation a little bit. You guys alluded to a number of elements that deal with the whole idea of athlete-centered coaching, and I believe in your last presentation you said traditions, and that really stood out in my mind in terms of the traditional way that managers hire coaches, base it on performance, and that performance is driven and development gets pushed onto the side. That's essentially how the sport in Canada works, and I've got a lot of research to back that up. What I'm asking though is this is a great concept to move forward with. Do you have any ideas on how to almost infect the whole management marketing mentality so that they start looking at coaches who are implementing some of these approaches that you guys are talking about, so that it can more as a marketing strategy for the fundamental lower levels to start bringing them in and create that fun, quote unquote, atmosphere?
Well, in my experience, one of the common things I see in sport is that our most experienced coaches coach our most experienced athletes.
Right.
Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you really think about it. And so, if within your sport you can find the right leadership to start to integrate at the entry level of your sport some of your most experienced coaches, and if they buy into the athlete-centered philosophy of making it fun and safe and developmentally appropriate and those sorts of things, I mean, I guess you start to change the culture of sort of one team at a time. And I think that is a great place to start. You know, I've helped with our provincial teams at home, and one of the comments that I make to the coaches is about, you know, understanding your own values around coaching, because it all starts with what you really truly believe. And athletes, you know, they get what we, oftentimes we coach the way we've been coached. And so if we believe that it's the tough love approach and the cursing and the swearing and the kicking garbage cans, then that's what the kids get. But if you believe that it's about creating an environment that is inclusive and that gives kids every opportunity and that is fair and respectful and all of those types of things, and you have somebody within your sport that is creditable, that espouses those same values, to me, that's your starter. Because, you know, often is the case, and I've had this experience where you have a young coach who's involved in coaching for not a very long time at an entry level of sport, primarily because they have kids that are involved and they've come along with their kids. They very much believe in an athlete-centered approach, but they're being poo-pooed by all of the older, more experienced coaches because they don't believe in that concept. So this person over here is a wingnut or a bleeding heart or whatever they are, when in fact their approach is really the way, you know, the organization should be looking to adopt that approach, and they probably keep more kids. So it's having somebody credible that's willing to stand up and say, I believe in this stuff, here's why I believe in this stuff, and then an organization that has the will to say, this is our philosophy, this is what we believe in, and when we hire coaches or when we interview for coaches, these are the types of things we're looking to have coaches implement, and examples of maybe other things they've done that demonstrate, maybe it's not in a sport environment, maybe it's in a workplace environment, where they've done things that have been more employee-centered in their approaches, but questions that get at their beliefs, their philosophies, and examples they can provide of how they have adapted that type of philosophy to other things they've done.
I think that's one of the things, though, as we quite often, as coaches, athletes, that you allow yourself to be sort of defined by those podium performances quite often. When you mentioned about coaching, and quite often those experienced coaches are classified as experienced at the competitive level, you know, the highest level within their sport. Sometimes those people don't even adopt sort of being a whole person. Because some of the best people I've ever heard met as coaches, and we've hit on some people here that have been a coach, but have also had that other job, whether it be in a school system, whether it be what have you, because then they can define to the athlete that yes, podium performance is a dream for everybody, but it's not a failure. When we have a kid who leaves 3 months in, 4 months in, at 14 years old, when you know in the end of thing it defines them as a person. Because I know I've had athletes come back, it was one of the things that I got caught up in when I first started coaching, because I felt like I was losing a lot of my best athletes. I still believe sometimes some of the people who potentially could have been the best leave early. But that said, I'm not bothered by it anymore, because some of those people might have gone on to become doctors, you know, and like I said, great reference letter. Some of them have gone on to become great in their business field, everything else. I'd much rather have that than having that person who wins that Olympic gold or what have you that we read about in the media, you know, far too often sometimes lately, that have dropped so far in societal values. And I think it's one of those things that we have to, if we adopt that person that as a coach, realizing we have to be a whole person, we can teach that to the athletes. In the end, we'll have someone be in 3 months, we'll have someone on the podium, we'll have all that level of athletes, but we have to stop defining success as just being that end, whether it be coaching or whether it be the actual athlete whether reaching there.
I believe, Derek, that 99.9% of the lives you're going to touch, those people are going to grow up and work for a living every day.
Oh, absolutely. And the defining thing from most successful business leaders, most successful workers, anyone who's ever been in a job interview in here, I guarantee their sports involvement has been brought up by that person who's been, you know, whether it was for a sports job or whether it was for any other job. One of the first things anybody ever doing job interviews always ask you, so tell me about the sport, because they know it's defining part.
Most of them have learned how to win and how to lose, and what it takes. And the ones that win understand how much effort it takes, and it's not just one thing, it's a complete package. So they learn life skills from day one.
I have a question. Mark, you were talking about like traditional coaches maybe poo-pooing the new ideas. How does that work within like a coaching staff for a team if there are conflicting coaching philosophies within that staff? Because like I coach football, and there's a very clear hierarchy. You get your head coach, you get your offensive, defensive coordinators, you get your positional coaches. Can any of you speak to that experience of maybe being in a team of coaches where philosophies conflict and how to navigate that?
I guess in my experience with Megan, it's about if you're going to be a coach, and it's an easy thing for me to say, perhaps with my experience in coaching, but you know, it's about aligning yourself with the philosophy or the belief of people that you're going to coach. You know, for example, I would never allow myself to be involved with people who didn't share my philosophies in terms of my beliefs, my core beliefs around how you treat people. Just wouldn't have them around because that's not who I am. It's not what I believe in. Therefore, it's not going to work. You know, I think having those conversations about what does a coach believe in. I mean, I think very few coaches ever stop to think about, or very few people who coach ever really stop to think about what are my core values around coaching? What do I really believe in? And how does what I believe in impact the kids I coach? I don't think a lot of people ever put that on paper, ever really think about what that means, ever think about how that translates into actions and behaviors. So for me, it would be about making sure, when I first became an assistant with the men's national team, I played for my old head coach. I knew going in that I could coach with him. Not that we saw the world exactly the same way, but I think our core beliefs around how you treat people, the kinds of things you do to make the environment a great place for athletes to be, I think those things we were pretty much on the same page about. So for the little bit of differences that we had, that wasn't a big deal. But I think a lot of it is you got to believe in the people you're around, and if you don't, and to me that's been no different than my career and my work. I've always been driven to work in environments that are proactive, that are leadership driven, where it's about positive energy and doing right by people. Because to me that's just part and parcel of the whole person, sort of as Earl's talking about. So I think trying to make sure that if you're in a leadership role, that you're implementing, you know, a philosophy that leads to that, and if you're not, then making very careful decisions around what you allow yourself to be involved.
I think sometimes you're involved in a team where the coaches are selected for you. You don't have the choice of selecting your own assistant coaches because you're coming together on a national program or something like that, and you're leading a group of 8 other coaches. And I think you start from the notion that some of the biggest problems we might have with coach conflict is the whole concept of power. You know, it's really hard. And I know head coaches who cannot work with other people. They can't work with assistant coaches. You have to learn how to work to share. I mean, kids have to learn how to do that. They do a pretty good job of it. And I think that a lot of times I prefer to work with the younger coaches because they're not so hung up on the traditional power. And if you're there are ways to deal with your assistants in terms of sitting down and making sure, though, that they have a task. I think if you can sit down with coaches and say, now, here's your role. This is a really important role that you've got. And I want you to really focus on this. And so they feel that they're sharing in the team. Because I think a lot of times coaches will come together and it suddenly becomes, I'm the first assistant. I'm the third assistant. I'm the head coach. And we create all these other roles now. Because we have we get greater coaching staff, so now we've got, I can remember in the NHL there was 1 coach behind the bench. Now there's 3 or 4. Now we got a defensive coach, the goalies coach, the offense coach, special teams coach. And that's good because if you put all those things together, it'll mesh. But I think that the big problem that I see in a lot of coaching is the fact that we haven't learned how to share well as coaches. And I would, how many of you have read Igniting the Third Factor? Any of you read it? Okay.
Igniting the Third Factor?
Igniting the Third Factor by Peter Jensen. If you can't find it in your library chapters, go to the business section. Because he is a sports psychologist. And one of the big things he does is work hard. He helps you work with people, and he helps you with your own goal setting and the goal setting of your staff and your team. And he comes from business as well, so he's got that kind of background. The neat thing about Peter Jensen, too, is after you finished his book, he has an online support system where if you've been reading a book and you've got questions or you want a dialogue, he has his own online system that supports the books he writes, which is really, really interesting. So, again, I can't, if I'm, educate yourselves, like, with a guy like Peter Jensen, I think you can learn a lot. I sure constantly learn every time I hear a guy like him. But it's learning how to interact too, I think, with coaches. And that's not easy. And I think a lot of it has to do with power, with their own self-concept as a coach.
It must be, because I realize that if you look at the same team all the time yourself, and you're the only one involved, if you don't have outside help from another professional or someone else who's expertise in that field, you can be overlooking things that you become accustomed to because you see them every day.
Yeah, as long as we're all open.
Yeah.
Because that's what we're trying to, that's what athlete-centered coaching is. We need to have coaching-centered coaching somehow, you know? Because I really think that that's part of our problem is we don't like to share very much. And I think as
in
coaches,
curling, that's very,
pardon?
in curling especially, that's very, very evident.
And I don't know, we can, you know, just think about how effective 4 really good coaches could be if they all work together.
Anyone have any other questions or comments they'd like to share?
What 3 world series or world championships were you playing in?
I went to Manila.
What sport?
Softball.
Oh,
Okay, well, I'd just like to thank our amazing panelists for sharing their thoughts and beliefs and philosophies. I know I learned a lot, and I'm excited to take that into my coaching career. Mark's just circulating some of the flyers about the ACC. It's going to be a really great conference to continue. It's just a lot of sessions like this, a lot of professional development, a lot of coaches all in one place to network and to continue to learn and better ourselves. So please look into that if you're interested. We have one more podium performance session before we retire, break for the summer, and that's 4 weeks from today, March 19th. It's an introduction to parasport from a coach standpoint, an athlete standpoint, and an administrator standpoint. We're going to have another panel. It's going to be, pardon me, really great if you're interested at all in getting involved on the para side. It's going to be some really good perspectives from administrators right up to David, Sabrina, Derek, who will be here talking on the athlete side, so and the coach side. So it's going to be really good, and if you've signed the sign-in sheet, you will get an email from both me and Minnow probably. So thank you all for coming.